The Boeing 777-300ER cruised smoothly at 38,000 feet, its twin engines humming a familiar, comforting lullaby to the 342 souls on board. Flight 407 from Tokyo to Los Angeles had been uneventful so far, a routine trans-Pacific crossing under the command of Captain Elias Monroe, a seasoned aviator with over 20,000 flight hours. His first officer, Ryan Calder, was equally experienced, and their relief crew, 2 additional pilots required for long-haul flights, relaxed in the crew rest quarters, waiting for their next shift. Among the passengers, 3 off-duty pilots, traveling as passengers, were enjoying their mid-flight break. Captain Linda Hawthorne of Delta Airlines, First Officer Mark O'Brien of British Airways, and an Air Force test pilot, Major Daniel Reeves, were scattered across different sections of the aircraft, unaware that soon their expertise would be called upon in the most unexpected of ways. Then, without warning, a loud explosion ripped through the aircraft. The entire fuselage trembled violently. Passengers gasped as oxygen masks deployed. The once serene cabin turned into chaos. The aircraft pitched sharply to the right, its nose dipping, alarms blaring in the cockpit. A crisis unfolds. "What the hell was that?" Captain Monroe barked as he grabbed the yoke, wrestling the plane back from its rapid descent. "Massive decompression." "Right engine failure," First Officer Calder called out, scanning the flashing warning lights across the instrument panel. "We're losing altitude fast. 15,000 feet per minute." Monroe's hands moved instinctively, initiating emergency procedures. "Deploying oxygen masks, declaring Mayday. Get me engine diagnostics now." The radio crackled as Monroe's distress call went out. "LAX Center, this is Flight 407. Mayday, Mayday. We've suffered an explosion. Possible uncontained engine failure. Rapid decompression. We are declaring an emergency." The aircraft shuddered violently again. "LAX Center, roger. Say intentions," came the response, but Monroe was already too busy stabilizing the uncontrollable descent. Meanwhile, in the cabin, passengers screamed. Flight attendants rushed to secure oxygen masks for panicked travelers. Major Reeves, still in his seat, knew something was horribly wrong. He unbuckled, moving toward the front. "I'm an Air Force pilot. What's happening?" Reeves shouted at a flight attendant. The attendant pointed toward the cockpit, barely able to remain standing as turbulence shook the plane. Reeves rushed forward, determined to offer whatever help he could. 6 pilots, 1 plane, no easy answers inside. The cockpit, Captain Monroe and First Officer Calder fought for control. The autopilot was unresponsive. The right engine was completely offline, its fan blades shredded. Worse still, structural damage to the fuselage meant the aircraft was struggling to hold altitude. The 777 was built to withstand single-engine operations, but at this rate of descent, they wouldn't make it to Los Angeles. The cockpit door opened abruptly. Reeves, still catching his breath, addressed the pilots. "Major Reeves, U.S. Air Force. I have extensive training on emergency aircraft. Recovery. Tell me what you need." Monroe barely glanced at him. "We need to stop this descent. Right now, we're 22,000 feet and falling." Reeves took the jump seat and started analyzing the instruments. "What's the status of hydraulics?" he asked. "Intermittent, at best," Calder replied. "Flight controls are sluggish." Just then, the relief crew, Captains Aaron Torres and Jacob Eng, entered the cockpit. Their expressions turned to shock as they took in the situation. "We heard the bang. What do you need?" Torres asked urgently. "More hands on deck. We're fighting a double emergency, engine failure and severe decompression. We need to slow this descent and find an alternate airport. We won't make LAX," Monroe said. Ingie grabbed a headset and radioed air traffic control while Torres began troubleshooting the hydraulic issues. The cockpit, now crammed with pilots, had become a battlefield for survival. Meanwhile, in the cabin, Captain Linda Hawthorne, sensing disaster, moved forward. "I'm a commercial pilot. "What's happening up there?" she asked a flight attendant. "The cockpit is full." "They're handling it," the attendant replied nervously. Hawthorne wasn't satisfied. She made her way to an unused jump seat near the galley, ready to assist if needed. A fight against time. "All right," Monroe said, his voice taut with focus. Check the flight controls. Tell me if we have full or partial control." Ing scanned the system. "Partial. Ailerons and rudder are responding, but the elevators are sluggish." Reeves exhaled sharply. "That means we can't properly nose up. We need to manually balance the descent." Torres, sweating, worked on stabilizing the engine output on the remaining engine. "If we push too hard, we risk overloading the good engine. If we don't, we might not stay airborne." "We need drag reduction," Calder added. "We can dump fuel, lighten the aircraft." Monroe made the call. "Do it. Dump fuel. We need to keep this bird in the sky." Calder activated the fuel dump system. As thousands of pounds of fuel jettisoned, Monroe tapped into all his experience. "Okay, we have to find a place to land. Closest option," checked. "Guam is an option, but at this rate we won't make it. Nearest viable runway is Midway Atoll, short but doable." Monroe nodded. "Midway, it is. Let ATC know. Everyone, brace for a challenging landing." The final gamble as the island runway came into sight. The aircraft had descended to 8,000 feet. The pilots had managed to level the plane, but landing without full hydraulic control meant the touchdown would be rough. "Everyone, listen up." Monroe addressed the cockpit. "Gear down manually. Keep spoilers ready. We need full flaps, but deploy carefully. We don't want asymmetric lift. Reeves, coordinate rudder trim manually." Reeves nodded. "Got it." As the plane aligned with the runway, passengers braced, silent prayers filling the cabin. The aircraft was coming in fast. Too fast. "Reverse thrust on standby," Torres called out, touching down in 3, 2, 1. Monroe pulled back gently. The 777 slammed into the tarmac, tires screeching, the airframe rattling violently. Monroe and Reeves fought to keep the plane centered. Reverse thrusters engaged, brakes screaming under the strain. Would they stop in time? The end of the runway approached. 8 feet. 8 feet. 10 feet. Then, the plane shuddered to a full stop, mere yards from the edge of the atoll's rocky coastline. Silence. And then applause erupted from the cabin. A miracle of teamwork. Monroe exhaled sharply, adrenaline still surging. He turned to the 5 pilots who had helped him achieve the impossible. "I think we just rewrote the textbook on emergency landings." Reeves grinned. "That was one hell of a team effort." Torres slumped in relief. 6 pilots, 1 plane, and a story we'll never forget. As passengers disembarked safely, the crew exchanged exhausted but knowing glances. 6 pilots had faced impossible odds, and together they had saved a doomed plane. The Boeing 777 sat motionless on the short Midway Atoll runway, the scent of burned rubber and hot metal still lingering in the humid air. Passengers and crew staggered out, some sobbing in relief, others stunned into silence. Emergency responders. What? Few were stationed on the small island, rushed to the scene, ensuring everyone was safe. Despite the catastrophic mid-air failure, all 342 passengers and crew had survived. Captain Elias Monroe leaned against the aircraft's fuselage, his uniform soaked in sweat, his hands still trembling from the intensity of the landing. Around him, the 5 other pilots who had helped him in the crisis stood catching their breath. "Monroe," Major Reeves said, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "You just pulled off a landing NASA would be jealous of." Monroe huffed out a breath. "And we couldn't have done it without every one of you. That was team flying at its absolute best." Ung was already on his satellite phone coordinating with airline operations and relaying their exact situation. "We're looking at least 24 hours before an emergency aircraft arrives," he announced grimly. We're stranded for the night, Hawthorne exhaled sharply. Guess we're getting to know Midway Atoll better than we ever planned. As night fell, the passengers were escorted to a makeshift holding area, a small aviation station where cots and emergency supplies were being distributed. Though the physical ordeal was over, another issue loomed. The damage to the aircraft was extensive, and the aviation officials on Midway feared the plane might not be able to fly again without significant repairs. Torres looked over the damage with a flashlight. We lost full use of one engine, the hydraulics are compromised, and the fuselage took a serious beating. If we try to take off without proper repairs, we're risking another catastrophe. But waiting for a recovery, plane means at least another day here, Hawthorne pointed out. With this many passengers, that's a logistical nightmare. Food and water supplies here are limited. Reeves crossed his arms. We don't have a choice. We wait until morning, get a full damage assessment, and then decide. Nobody flies unless it's safe. Reluctantly, the group agreed. Exhausted passengers curled up on their cots, trying to get some rest. But the 6 pilots weren't done yet. They had a long night ahead of them. At first light, a small maintenance crew on the island conducted a closer inspection of the aircraft. The findings weren't promising. The engine is completely shot, the lead mechanic reported. That's not getting fixed here. You're running on one engine, which is already a risk. But the biggest problem is your hydraulic system. If that fails completely mid-flight, you're done. Aang glanced at Monroe. We should wait for a rescue aircraft. We should, Monroe agreed, but there was something in his voice. Hesitation. Reeves noticed it. You've got another idea, don't you? Monroe ran a hand through his hair. If we get basic control functions working, we could attempt a short-hop flight to a larger airstrip, like Wake Island. It's closer than Guam and has more facilities. That's insane, Torres muttered. We barely made it here. But we made it, Monroe countered. And I'd rather take my chances on a short controlled flight than leave over 300 passengers stranded on a remote atoll for who knows how long. The group fell silent. It was an impossible decision. Stay put and wait, or take a calculated risk. Finally, Calder spoke. If we're doing this, we do it together. We prep everything, double-check every system, and we go only if we're certain we have a shot. With a newfound purpose, the pilots sprang into action. They worked alongside the maintenance crew, patching up hydraulic lines as best they could, testing controls, and meticulously planning every detail of the flight. NG and Torres ran simulations on their onboard systems, estimating fuel consumption, takeoff velocity, and approach procedures at Wake Island. Hawthorne and Calder managed passenger morale, explaining the situation while ensuring everyone remained calm. Meanwhile, Monroe and Reeves coordinated with Midway's limited air traffic services, securing emergency clearance for their risky takeoff. As the morning wore on, conditions were deteriorating. Storm clouds loomed in the distance, and satellite reports indicated increasing turbulence en route. If we're going, it has to be now, Monroe decided, before the weather traps us here. The passengers took their seats, nervous energy crackling through the cabin. Monroe sat in the captain's chair once more, with Calder beside him. The remaining pilots took strategic positions throughout the aircraft, ready to assist at a moment's notice. All right, Monroe said, his grip tightening on the controls. Let's get this bird in the air. With a deep breath, he pushed the throttle forward. The plane lurched forward on the runway, the single-functioning engine straining under the weight of the aircraft. The damaged hydraulics made it harder to keep the nose aligned. Speed alive, Reeves called out from his monitoring position. Monroe's heart pounded. The runway was short. If they didn't get airborne in time, rotate, Calder shouted. Monroe pulled back on the yoke. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then the nose lifted. The plane struggled, wobbled, and then they were airborne. A collective cheer erupted from the passengers, but the pilots had no time to celebrate. The climb was rough, the controls sluggish, Every movement required delicate handling, in DE called. Out. We've got 150 miles to Wake Island. Hold her steady. As they approached Wake, the turbulence worsened. The storm had arrived sooner than expected, whipping the aircraft with violent gusts. Hawthorne, monitoring altitude, shouted, "We're losing lift. Monroe, adjust pitch." "Trying." Monroe gritted his teeth, wrestling with the controls. The plane bucked like a wild stallion, the damaged systems barely holding. Torres gripped his seat. "We have to commit now. If we go around, we might not get another chance." "Landing gear down," Reeves confirmed. The runway loomed ahead, rain pelting the windshield. Monroe took a breath, focusing every ounce of his being on the approach. Steady, steady. The wheels touched down, hard. The aircraft jolted, skidding across the rain-slick runway. Reverse thrusters roared to life, brakes fighting against. Inertia. The plane slid, veering slightly. Then, at last, it stopped. Silence. Then, the entire cabin exploded into applause and cheers. Monroe exhaled deeply. "We made it." Reeves let out a laugh, shaking his head. "You're either the best damn pilot I've ever flown with, or the craziest." "Both," Calder smirked. As the crew assisted passengers in disembarking, Monroe stood back, watching his team, his fellow pilots. They had faced an impossible situation, and together they had beaten the odds. As emergency responders approached the aircraft, Torres turned to the group. "So, any of you ever want to do this again?" The laughter that followed was the sweetest sound Monroe had ever heard.